Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Gregory Treverton, who stepped down as chairman of the National Intelligence Council in January of 2017. He is a senior advisor with the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a professor of the practice of international relations and spatial sciences at the University of Southern California. Earlier, he directed the RAND Corporation's Center for Global Risk and Security, and before that, its Intelligence Policy Center and its International Security and Defense Policy Center. Also, he was Associate Dean of the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He has served in government for the first Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He has taught at Harvard and Columbia Universities in addition to RAND, has been a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and deputy director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He holds an AB summa cum laude from Princeton University and a master's in public policy and PhD in economics and politics from Harvard. Greg Treverton, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to cover two very broad items with you, Greg. First, I want you to give our audience an intelligence perspective on national security. Audience members know that to date, and we are recording this in early February 2021, to date, we have had quite a few Department of Defense experts to talk about information operations and cognitive security from a DoD perspective. However, you are the very first intelligence expert on the podcast, somebody with very deep intelligence experience. And so I'm really interested to get the intelligence perspective on the information problem that we're in. So that's number one. And then second, I'd like to get into your thought leadership and some of your recommendations regarding data governance, which is a topic that goes right to the heart of some of the challenges that we are facing relative to information and cognitive security. Before we get into those two topics, could you describe what you perceive to be your skill set is? You have led government organizations and think tanks, you've written books, you've performed basic research, you're a teacher. What are you?
Well, my mother would say I could never hold a job. That was my problem, right? I think of myself as someone who does mostly strategy and thinking about the future, but always with an objective of making the practice better. As you said, I've been in and out of the government more times than should be allowed. So my work has always been trying to make intellectual products, strategic ones, things about the future, make them useful to the actual making and implementing of policy.
Okay, fair enough. So we just read in your bio that you held a leadership position in the intelligence community until January of 2017. That was not too long ago. So among other things, the National Intelligence Council has produced a suite of global trend reports going back, I think, into the 1990s at least, as well as intelligence estimates. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about what the National Intelligence Council is and how do you go about examining trends and publishing trends?
Oh, thank you. I'm more than happy to talk about the National Intelligence Council or the NIC. I was vice chair 20 years ago, which shows how slow a riser I am. But I had the chance to be the chair in the second Obama administration, which was a wonderful time. The NIC is the Director of National Intelligence's interagency arm for intelligence analysis, right? So if the president wants to know what the CIA thinks about a particular issue, he can ask. But if typically the question comes to what does the intelligence community think about this particular issue. Then the NIC convenes the relevant analysts from all over the intelligence agencies and comes up with an answer. If there's dissent, the dissents are noted. The most traditional NIC product was national intelligence estimates. Those typically are ones that seek to reach out at least several years, but they also try to put issues in context to try and indicate how important particular issues are. That was, for most of the NIC's existence, some 40 years, the main thing that the National Intelligence Council did. That changed with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence in 2004. Now the NIC also provides current intelligence support to the policy committees in the National Security Council. Those are the Principals Committee, the Cabinet Secretaries responsible for national security, and their deputies, the Deputies Committee. In the Obama administration, those committees, particularly the deputies, met all the time, at least once a day. And so the NIC was producing a steady stream of not all tactical, but more immediate intelligence support. So we would typically try to be a bit more strategic by saying, okay, you ask us this question, and we'll answer that, but you might be interested in this question that's a little bit more strategic. That was always the challenge, given the pace. My last year at the NIC, we must have done 700 pieces of paper or sets of bytes on computers. About 400 of those were pretty directly tasked in governmentese from the National Security Council.
You and your team published the Global Trends 2035 report, and this was back in 2017. And you called it a paradox of progress. And we will have links to this report in the show notes, along with the other items that we will be discussing. I'd like to read a short passage from this report and ask you to expound on it. So some of this was just spot on and very prescient. So for the audience, bear in mind that this was published in January of 2017. So the thinking on this probably dates back into the late 2016 timeframe. And so here is an excerpt from that Global Trends report. We are living in a paradox. The achievements of the industrial and information ages are shaping a world to come that is both more dangerous and richer with opportunity than ever before. Whether promise or peril prevails will turn on the choices of humankind. The progress of the past decades is historic, connecting people, empowering individuals, groups, and states, and lifting 1 billion people out of poverty in the process. But this same progress has also spawned shocks like the Arab Spring, the 2008 global financial crisis, and the global rise of populist, anti-establishment politics. These shocks reveal how fragile the achievements have been, underscoring deep shifts in the global landscape that portend a dark and difficult near future. The next 5 years will see rising tensions within and between countries. That was January 2017. Could you comment on that and maybe drop that into today's context too?
Unfortunately, I think we got it just about right. We've been living through that paradox. Certainly the lifting of 1 billion people out of poverty is, if not the most important event in human history, very much up there. But that said, we're very aware of the paradox and we've been living through it for the last few years. Mr. Trump didn't cause that paradox, but it certainly deepened it with the disaffection of people from their governments around the world for different reasons, with growing inequality, at least in the United States and some other rich countries. Globally, inequality is going down, but it's going up within particular countries. So we do see the evidence of the paradox all around us, and it's been glaringly evident in the really fractured response by the United States, but also lots of other countries to the COVID pandemic.
Something also very relevant to this moment, in that document, there is no less than 50 or maybe 60 occurrences of the word disease, and talking about disease as a vivid national security challenge that we need to be mindful of. Again, this was 5 years ago. Could you talk about the current COVID pandemic? And I heard you speak in another forum where you talked about wicked problems, and you contextualized that in the COVID crisis. Could you take that in whatever direction you think is fruitful to talk about disinformation and COVID and the notion of wicked problems in general?
Disease has obviously been on the NICS and to some extent the intelligence community. It hasn't been primary business, but it's been important issue for the National Intelligence Council for a very long time. The global trends that came out in 2004, which was Global Trends 2020, it described this pandemic and its implications for globalization and global travel almost exactly. Didn't say when it was going to happen, didn't say it was going to happen by 2020, but it said as we look out over the next 20 years, there's a very significant chance of a major pandemic. Other people said it, and I'd written about it as well. So in some sense, while the pandemic has aspects of wicked problems, I think of wicked problems as ones that come with not much context, where there are many different actors interacting in ways we haven't quite seen before. There's not much history. There's not much theory. Those are wicked problems. And the pandemic has some aspects of wickedness to it. It's certainly wicked in its results, awful in its results. But in some ways, it caught us by surprise when it shouldn't have, I think. We had the chance to practice, as it were, on SARS and H1N1. We were lucky in that those were either not very lethal or not very communicable. But that said to me, and I wrote about this a few years ago, that since we were lucky, we might not be lucky the next time. We might find one that was both pretty lethal and pretty communicable, which is what we've got. And we should have realized, I think, immediately that if it was going to be in China, it was in China, it was going to be here. Globalization, we know it's going to be here no matter what we try and do. We did shut off air travel for a bit to foreign countries, but that was both too late and probably not really very helpful given the multiple entry points that the virus had. But we should have known it was coming, and at least begun preparing, building up equipment, and especially building up tests as in early January, really, by mid-January for sure. But we lost a couple of months. So I think of this as a kind of intelligence failure, not a failure by the intelligence community necessarily, since it's the medical community that's primarily responsible, but working with intelligence. But it does seem to be an intelligence failure. And then, of course, it was a horrible failure of implementation. Once we were in it, we just did almost everything exactly wrong. And so it does, for me, sadly, qualifies as probably the biggest government mistake in the history of the Republic, at least in terms of lives needlessly lost.
Is there anything else in the 2017 report, Greg, that the intelligence community brought to our national awareness, which you'd also would like to call out here as something important that we all need to know about and mitigate against potentially?
Well, the other important one, obviously, is climate change, about which the Paradox of Progress talks considerably. That obviously has been on the agenda, has been on people's agenda, but I think it was important for the intelligence community to keep reminding the people that it is a national security issue. I mean, if you think about the two existential threats out there to the United States, the short run one is pandemics, the long run threat, existential threat, is climate change. So the NIC in particular, but other parts of the intelligence community have been consistent about talking about that, not being the science, but saying if the science is as the scientific consensus appears, then here are the national security implications, and they're really quite dramatic. I was concerned. I wanted to release that Global Trends in December, didn't get it done till January. So I realized that in January I needed to take it to the new administration as well. And I was worried because, needless to say, that was an administration not very concerned about climate change or the climate crisis. And we talked a lot about it. So I didn't want to have a fight with them. But I took it to Michael Flynn, who was perhaps happily otherwise engaged, shall we say, at the time. And so I don't think he or anybody else paid much attention to it. But it certainly was a clarion call about the climate crisis.
What, in a national security context, are some of the major callouts relative to the climate crisis and national security?
We know that the effects are going to be felt on other places first, or the ones they'll be places we care about. We know already that so many of international issues are about water. The Darfur conflict in Africa is always was mostly about water, and we know those conflicts are going to get sharper as rainfall patterns change, as desertification proceeds in Africa. We also know that more violent storms and sea level rise is going to lead to lots of migration, and those migrants will often migrate toward places where they're either not welcome or where they're not easy to sustain them. So migration is going to be a big problem for us. The main problem will be more severe storms and drought, different patterns in different parts of the country. But the big effects, I think, already have hit, and will hit countries that we care about or countries we have humanitarian interests in first. And it's also worth remembering that some of the lowest lying islands in the world are in the Caribbean. So those are people who are going to move before they get their feet wet. And obviously that'll increase pressure to migrate to the United States as well. So most of the effects of climate change for the immediate future are going to be second order for the United States. That is, effects on countries we care about or on our ability to do things with other countries. Obviously the big effects on us too, but those will play out over a somewhat longer time horizon, I think.
Does this report have anything meaningful to say about information operations being levied at the homeland or elsewhere in the world, especially, well, so we were just talking about COVID and climate change. Both topics are rife with all kinds of disinformation, presumably designed to exploit fissures in our national discourse and divide the nation further. Have you and your intelligence colleagues done some thinking along those lines?
Oh, absolutely. The report talks quite a lot about the changing nature of warfare and gets in there to the nature of cyber warfare, of information warfare. So there's a section about that. It also came in the shadow of the 2016 elections, obviously. So one of the things I was doing in my last acts at the NIC was overseeing the preparation of the report on what happened in 2016, the one that went to both the outgoing Obama administration and the incoming Trump administration. So that set of issues was very much on our minds. Not much of that found its way into the Global Trends report, but it was going on at the same time. So that was obviously a kind of a wake-up call. What happened in 2016 came as a surprise to us, but it probably shouldn't have. There was, for instance, a private group that was looking at jihadi websites, and they found in 2014 that many of the people posting on the Free Syria site were not Syrians, but were Russians. So they understood the Russians were active in disinformation very early. They said they came to the United States government. Happily, they didn't come to me, so I plead innocent. But their response apparently was the government said, well, we're not really interested in Russians. We're interested in jihadis. So it came as a surprise, but it shouldn't have come as a surprise to us.
Right. And all of that goes right back to the paradox of progress and what we read earlier from that report. Stunning. So I'd like to turn the discussion, if I may, to your present project. So you co-founded the Global TechnoPolitics Forum. I'm always fascinated with names, and people generally, pick out names thoughtfully. So the Global TechnoPolitics Forum, could you tell our audience what that name means, especially the term technopolitics?
Yes, our intent was to, and is, to work really at the intersection of technology and geopolitics. The basic assumptions are that there is a tight connection between the two. For instance, the big technology companies, the tech giants now, are really geopolitical actors in their own right. They're here to stay, and they are important geopolitical actors. So hence technopolitics. It is global. All those technologies are global, particularly in the information area. And Forum came from wanting to not just study these issues, but actually be a place at which answers might be found and actions might be started. So that was the origin of the Global TechnoPolitics Forum. And we've been continuing to work at that intersection of technology and geopolitics and looking toward convening gatherings, not just to discuss interesting research, but to try and come up with agendas for action.
Very good. You recently authored a piece with the co-founder of your center, Pardee RAND. I hope I pronounced that okay. I'd like to discuss this piece. It's called Data, Governance and Geopolitics. It's a fantastic read. Again, we'll have a link to this in the show notes. But before we get into the heart of this discussion, this document has some really interesting cover artwork. And on some of the inside pages there, it says that the title of this artwork is On White 2 by Wasily Kandinsky. And it was painted in 1923. I believe he was a Russian artist. Why did you guys pick this as the cover artwork for this piece?
Well, it's an interesting story. The choice was really Padee's. She's an architect by training, so she's used to visual things. And Kandinsky's always been a model for her. She thinks of Kandinsky as a very intellectual painter, and that appeals. He's also a painter who starts with a pattern, but then also has a lot of chaos in his paintings. And that seemed to both of us a kind of metaphor for where we stand with data and data governance. There is some pattern to it, but there's also a lot of chaos. So that seemed like, on all accounts, that's maybe a more thoughty reconstruction of our reason than is appropriate, but it seemed exactly the right thing to have on the cover.
Yeah, that's great. I think it really does help tell that story a bit, that from a bird's eye view, life looks messy sometimes, but if you're thoughtful about analyzing situations, patterns emerge which are helpful for managing or exploiting whatever the subject matter is at hand. So let's talk a little bit more about governance and geopolitics. What are the key takeaways from this report?
We thought of the report as a kind of a sophisticated primer, something that if a Senate staffer was relatively new to these issues, he or she could read it and get up to speed fairly quickly. What's striking is that the governance of data, such as it is, it's really like the governance of the web. It's mostly private sector driven. It's mostly bottom up. It's slightly haphazard, more than slightly haphazard. And so that's the biggest takeaway, I think, that there are kind of overlapping governance structures, missing governance structures. If you think about the range of issues, the three big data issues in front of us, the ones that get most of the attention, are really privacy. Second is probably competition, antitrust, that set of issues. And third is how do you police to keep false facts, keep disinformation off the web? Those are the ones that have got most of the attention, but we also wanted to spell out the other ways in which data is governed or not. It obviously has trade, big deal in trade, and some trade agreements cover digital materials, others not. So trade is, and you can think of data localization requirements as a kind of a non-tariff barrier. So there's intersection between how we think about the movement of data and trade agreements. Obviously, cybersecurity is a big deal. And we also include a section on data and diplomacy. So the second big takeaway, I think, is just how many aspects there are to the problem of governing data. It's also, and then we try and look at each of those in turn. The focal point of attention for privacy has been the European Union GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, and secondarily the California Consumer Privacy Act. What's interesting to me is neither of those was enacted by a nation state. One was done by the EU and the other was done by California. The GDPR has become kind of the model for lots of other nations, so nations have embraced it. But it's an interesting question, and the topic is moving so fast, so that the great virtue of GDPR is it requires people to opt in to having their data collected by these big platforms. The big question for me is, how long can that last as data continues to multiply? It's one thing now if you're worried about your address, but when you've got sensors all over your body and all over your house, how do you realistically consent to that data being used in useful ways? So there's a lot. I suppose the big message is there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about how data is governed. Data really is the black gold of the 21st century. It has a lot in common with that black gold of oil, but in some ways it's fundamentally different. Oil was valuable in and of itself. Data is really relational. It gets more valuable the more of it there is. So if someone knows where I am today, that's useful. But if they know I'm here today and for 30 days after today, they can pretty much guess that I'm sequestered here and therefore reliably here. So that relational aspect of data matters a lot. And we talk about that too.
Right. Are you familiar, Greg, with a concept called the Red Queen hypothesis?
No.
It's taken from Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen says to Alice something like, the faster you run, the more you stay in the same place, or you have to keep running faster and faster just to keep up, and you have to run twice as fast in order to get ahead. And it's used typically in an evolutionary biology type of a context, like an arms race. But I think it's also very appropriate to technology. There's what is that other assertion of it's not Moore's law, but it's like there's a technology law about technology doubling every year. Do you know what I'm talking about there?
Yes, yeah, right.
Yeah. It is also in that same kind of a thought space that things are happening increasingly faster. It's almost like all of the R&D that the government is doing these days, or not all of it, but maybe a big chunk of it could be put under the umbrella of faster and better decision making and using AIs and data in order to out-OODA loop our adversaries. And what you were just talking about in this data and governance, also is probably a foundational part of that kind of a concept, and getting data governance and sharing of data, and but while simultaneously keeping it secure. And that whole management space is part of a larger project to make better and faster decisions.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It does require faster and better. That's the goal, and artificial intelligence is obviously going to play a big role. The intelligence community, to harken back to it, has done pretty well. Obviously its problem is in some ways harder than that of the big tech companies. They want to know where you're going to be tomorrow so they can shower you with ads for things you're interested in. And that's at least a bounded problem. The intelligence community obviously is trying to think where the world is going. That's a much bigger one. So I give the the community some leave, given the difficulty it faces. But its challenge really, I think, is to use big data usefully, use big data with artificial intelligence, but do so in ways that continue to keep the analyst in the loop. Because if the analyst doesn't understand what's going on, if he or she doesn't have at least some insight to the algorithms, then it's going to be very difficult for them to trust the results, and even more difficult to explain them to policymakers who typically aren't deeply versed in the technology. So that's the particular challenge, I think, that intelligence faces as it moves forward.
Yeah, your piece also addresses what I would consider to be maneuver in a macroeconomic or geopolitical sense, maneuvering in order to get into some kind of a favorable strategic position. And the section I'm thinking of is your discussion about standards and how I think China in particular has made moves to create data and capability standards which favor them over competitors in the world. Can you talk a little bit about the standards and how that fits into this whole discussion?
Yeah, standards is very much a part of this issue. We talked a little bit earlier about data localization, but those kinds of regulations about where data resides, where it has to be kept, those kinds of things, or standards for what is collected, those are very much, it seems to be, obviously have a political as well as an economic effect. Data localization requirements can look like non-tariff barriers because they keep data from flowing across borders, but they also have obviously an important political importance. Even apparently mundane things like where data centers are located has become a big political issue. So I think the lesson there is that many of these things we think of as really kind of highly technical, like standards, like data localization, like even physical location of data centers, have become political, if not geopolitical issues as we go forward, and they need to be thought of in that way.
Right. And standards, I mean, a standard could be everything from, what kind of electrical outlet is used predominantly across the world to some kind of a data structure and what is accepted by most people or most organizations. And so whichever, in this case, country, drives the standards that are adopted across the world, then that country and its corporations potentially have a competitive leg up.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why that's one of the roots of the concern about Huawei and 5G. Obviously, that's a big issue in front of us, and it's in some ways it's not China's fault. It's our own fault for abandoning that particular space that Huawei now occupies more than anybody else. But that is a signal case in how these technical IT issues really have big political significance. You see in our European friends and allies who on the one hand are worried about the security implications of Huawei. On the other hand, there's not really any other game in town at the current moment. The other competitors are pretty small. So it is a nice illustration of how these, again, apparently technical issues really become, in our world, in our connected world, become big political questions as well.
So you said that this piece partially is intended for government policymaker consumption, and you've got some recommendations going forward that you call your Digital 20 or D20 initiative. Could you talk about some of the things that could help de-risk in this area?
That's very important to us, and thanks for asking about it. That D20 or Digital 20 idea comes from the background that our current international organizations, which have done wonderful things in the last 70 years, but mostly still reflect the Bretton Woods agreement of 70 years ago, and they have shortcomings. They don't fit our current problems so well. They underrepresent new powers like China, and China, I think fairly to some extent, feels like the existing international regime is stacked against it, hence it's trying to create its own institutions or adapt the ones it sees. And maybe even more important, our current international arrangements don't really incorporate the private sector in the way it should. Now, most of the things that are driving these technologies are private sector driven, not government. The private sector is pretty much underrepresented. I remember at a deputies committee meetings of the number twos, we were talking about alliances and partnerships in the Obama administration, and the conversation was very much about intergovernmental relations. I finally said, well, what about the private sector? And everybody said, yes, really important. But then 2 minutes later, we were back in the same intergovernmental pattern. So the idea behind the D20, the digital 20, is that we want to put a broader set of stakeholders in the room, sure governments, but also the big tech companies themselves, who are powerful players, but also important elements in civil society that typically are underrepresented in these conversations. So that's the idea, to put that right set of people together, paralleling the G20 in some respects, but with a much wider set of stakeholders, not just governments, but companies, private sector, civil society, and with an emphasis on looking for cooperative solutions. The tech companies aren't going to go away. They may be regulated, they may even be broken up, but they're here to stay in one form or another. And our sense is that to too great an extent, we are approaching these issues of the 21st century with a 20th century toolbox. Sure, regulation and antitrust can be important, but rather than looking for national solutions and kind of punitive solutions, we think we should be on the hunt for more global and more cooperative approaches. That's the basic underlying notion of the D20.
Right. All of that sounds like it's spot on and very much in keeping with some of the themes that we have had on the podcast, with the notion of partnering with our friends and allies, or establishing better communications and relationships within our own government, but also really realigning our R&D with the private sector and developing that innovation mindset, has never been more important than now. And also, you didn't say this, but when you're talking about the D20, I also think whole of government or whole of society effort in order to keep this precious experiment, this shining city on the hill, to keep us up and running and the lights on, is all critical going forward. Would you agree with all of that?
Yes, absolutely. No, the issues, I should have said earlier, the issues really go to the essence of what we are as a democracy. And you're exactly right about whole of government, whole of society. I was asked to do some work for the Swedish government on what happened in 2016 to us as they prepared for their 2018 elections, and drove home that this has to be not just a whole of government, but a whole of society endeavor. And that's tough for us. We find it hard to coordinate our government, much like the society. We've shown that in spades in the COVID pandemic. But it is the real challenge that has a role to play. But the key actors are going to be those in the private sector, and Scandinavians, for example, have done, I think, much better than we have at driving home that lesson. This is sort of every citizen's responsibility, and countering disinformation is not something that is done by the government or a few big tech platforms alone, but it is really something that needs to be a whole of society endeavor.
Right. I wonder what the 21st century version of World War II victory gardens, or Rosie the Riveter type, rallying campaigns might be for the 21st century to help align ourselves as a country and patriotically against these forces that are at work to nibble away at the foundations until it's at a critical point.
Absolutely. Google and Facebook get all the attention, but and deserve it probably. But I'm at least somewhat hopeful because there do seem to be lots of efforts out there, really grassroots efforts to try and do serious journalism, do serious telling of truth, to help identify falsity. So there is some grassroots, not quite yet victory gardens, but it's at least the beginnings of lots of things out there in society trying to say this isn't just the government's responsibility, it's really ours, and we can do a lot by trying to create, to discover truth, and also point out untruth. So I'm at least slightly hopeful by virtue of those initiatives.
Right, and I tend to be hopeful as well. I tend to have a lot of faith in human ingenuity, and as you were recounting with the COVID crisis, it's not like the National Security Council didn't know that disease and pandemics were a looming issue, especially in our networked world. And so people, the crooked timber of humanity, we tend to wait until the last minute before doing something, and waiting until a crisis is not just a distant possibility, but it's a vivid reality before actually doing something. So I do tend to believe in ingenuity and being able to innovate our way out of problems, but I certainly don't think that we should just go all in on on that, especially on these kinds of existential matters where our ability to innovate, the roll of the dice might not work out on some of these things. So we definitely need to do something preemptively in order to manage through. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, Greg, and I like to ask all guests if they could recommend a book, possibly, that either discusses what we've been talking about or something altogether different, which our audience might appreciate that they don't already know about. Do you have a book that you could recommend to us?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking mostly about our conversation about the Global TechnoPolitics Forum and the data issue. There, an interesting book is called Terms of Disservice by Dipayan Ghosh. It really talks about the basic structure of the internet industry writ large. My view is that basically the tech giants have kind of lucked into a business model that is hugely lucrative, but also hugely predatory of information. And Ghosh does a good job of talking about all those issues. On a more philosophical bent, I was struck a couple of years ago by, of all people, Henry Kissinger's piece on these issues, a very philosophical piece called How the Enlightenment Ends. It was published in The Atlantic in 2018.
Okay, fantastic, Greg. We will include links to those books in the show notes. And with that, Greg Treverton, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
My pleasure, John. Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.